People always say money can't buy everything. I used to believe that. I don't anymore. Not because I lost faith, but because I watched someone try to buy me, and I let them think they succeeded. Let me start from the beginning. My name is Tessa. I'm 31 years old, and for the last 4 years, I've worked as a forensic contracts attorney at a mid-size firm in Charleston, South Carolina. What that means, in plain language, is that I find the holes in financial agreements that people thought were airtight. I trace money. I follow paper trails. I find what's hidden. It's not glamorous work. Most days it's spreadsheets and deposition prep and cold coffee, but I'm good at it. Really good. I met my husband, who I'll just call my husband because that's what he was to me for 3 years, at a charity gala his family sponsored. He was charming in that effortless way that only men who've never had to try too hard can be. His mother, I'll call her what she was to me for 3 years, my mother-in-law, stood at the center of everything that night, like a planet with her own gravitational pull. Dressed in ivory, holding a champagne flute, never once walking toward anyone. They all came to her. I should have noticed that then. I noticed it later. We dated for 8 months. He proposed at the end of those 8 months and I said yes because I was 27 and in love, and because when you're 27 and in love, you think love is enough. His family had money, old money, the kind that doesn't talk about itself, in commercial real estate across 3 states. My family had a 2-bedroom house in Greenville, and a mother who worked double shifts at a hospital for 20 years. I knew we came from different worlds. I told myself it didn't matter. My mother-in-law made it matter. She never said anything outright cruel. She was too careful for that. It was always the pause before she answered a question I asked, as if she needed a moment to translate my words from a language she didn't quite speak. It was the way she'd compliment my dress by saying, "That color is so brave on you." It was the dinner parties where she'd seat me at the far end of the table and then look genuinely puzzled when I mentioned it later, like the thought that it hurt me had simply never occurred to her as a possibility. My husband saw none of it, or he chose not to. I'm still not sure which. We'd been married 2 years when I got pregnant. It wasn't planned, but when I saw that test I felt something shift inside me. Something quiet and certain and completely mine. I called my mom first. She cried. I cried. We stayed on the phone for an hour saying nothing in particular. My mother-in-law's reaction when we told her over dinner was to set down her fork, look at my husband, and say, "Well, we'll need to revisit the estate planning documents." Not congratulations. Not a hug. Estate planning documents. I filed that away. The pregnancy was hard. I had hyperemesis for the first 4 months. The kind of nausea that keeps you horizontal, that makes you lose 12 pounds, that turns water into an enemy. I worked from home when I could and from the bathroom floor when I couldn't. My husband traveled 3 weeks out of every month for work. I managed. That's what I did. I managed. What I didn't know, what I found out much later, was that during those 3 weeks every month, he wasn't always where he said he was. I was 38 weeks pregnant when my water broke on a Tuesday morning. I drove myself to the hospital because my husband was in Atlanta, or so I thought, and my mom was 4 hours away in Greenville. My neighbor, a retired teacher named June, sat with me in the waiting room for 2 hours until the nurses moved me back. My daughter was born at 11:42 that night, 6 pounds 4 ounces. She had my nose and her father's ears and the most serious expression I've ever seen on someone with no teeth. The nurses put her on my chest and I thought, this is it. This is the thing I didn't know I was waiting for. My husband arrived at the hospital at 2 in the morning. He'd driven from Atlanta, he said. He kissed my forehead. He held our daughter for approximately 4 minutes before his phone buzzed, and he stepped into the hallway. He was gone for 40 minutes. When he came back, he smelled like someone else's perfume. I noticed. I said nothing. I was holding a 6-hour-old baby and I had stitches in places I don't need to describe, and I made the decision in that moment to file it away with everything else and deal with it when I had both feet on the ground. My mother-in-law arrived the next morning. She didn't come alone. She walked into my recovery room at 9 a.m. with a woman I had never seen before, early 30s, professionally dressed, carrying a leather portfolio. My husband was not with her. My daughter was asleep in the bassinet beside me. I had been awake for 31 hours. I hope you're feeling well, my mother-in-law said in the tone of someone who hopes no such thing. I asked who the woman with her was. She's my attorney, my mother-in-law said. I thought it would be better to handle this directly rather than through intermediaries. Handle what? I asked. She sat down in the chair beside my bed without being invited. She folded her hands in her lap, and then she told me, in the same tone she used to discuss table arrangements and charity auction lots, that she was prepared to offer me $2 million to sign a separation agreement, relinquish my parental rights, and leave my husband's life permanently. $2 million. My daughter was 14 hours old. I looked at her. I looked at the attorney, who was staring at a fixed point on the wall like she'd trained herself not to make eye contact during these conversations. I looked at my daughter in the bassinet. Why? I asked. My mother-in-law's expression didn't change. Because this marriage was a mistake, and we both know it. You've always known you don't belong in this family. I'm simply offering you a clean exit with financial security. We both know it, as if she'd had access to my internal monologue for 3 years. And my husband knows you're here, I asked. This is a family matter, she said. Which was not an answer. I told her I needed time to think. She said I had until the end of the week. She left the leather portfolio on the bedside table, the separation agreement, printed and tapped for signature, and walked out with her attorney. The whole conversation had lasted 11 minutes. I know because I'd started timing it on my phone when she sat down. I looked at my daughter. I picked up my phone, not to call a divorce attorney, not to call my mom. I called my paralegal, a 26-year-old named Derek who I'd trained myself and who was, in my professional opinion, the sharpest person in our office. I need you to pull everything you can find on the Hargrove Family Trust, I said. That was my mother-in-law's family trust, the one that controlled the real estate portfolio, the one my husband stood to inherit from. Formation documents, amendments, any recorded distributions, everything. Derek said, when do you need it? I looked at my daughter. Yesterday. Here's what you need to understand about my mother-in-law. She was not a stupid woman. She was meticulous, calculated, and patient in the way that people are when they've spent decades protecting something. But she had made one significant error in judgment. She had assumed that because I came from a family without money, I didn't understand how money worked. Derek called me back in 4 hours. The trust had a provision I hadn't known about, one my husband had never mentioned. The trust was structured so that the primary male heir had to produce a legitimate child, recognized under the terms of the document, before the age of 35 in order to receive his full inheritance. My husband was 33. Our daughter had been born the day before. Under the literal language of the trust document, our daughter, my daughter, was his qualifying heir. If I signed away my parental rights, if I left, the trust provision became significantly more complicated. The inheritance timeline would be disrupted. The family would have to either challenge the trust terms or wait for my husband to have another qualifying child, which, according to the medical records I subpoenaed 6 weeks later, was unlikely. He had a condition he'd never told me about, had never told anyone about apparently. My mother-in-law hadn't offered me $2 million to protect her son from an unhappy marriage. She'd offered me $2 million because she'd miscalculated how much I actually knew. I spent 3 days in that hospital room thinking. I was discharged on Thursday. My husband picked us up, held the car seat, said the right things. That night, after our daughter was asleep, I sat across from him at the kitchen table and asked him directly where he'd been the night she was born. He lied. A specific, detailed, confident lie. The kind that takes practice. I nodded. I said, okay. I went to bed. The next morning I called my mother-in-law and told her I'd sign. She arrived at our house that same afternoon. No attorney this time. Just her, in a cream blouse, looking like she'd already won. She had the agreement ready. She'd revised it. $3 million now, not 2. A goodwill gesture, she called it, as if the extra million was a tip for my inconvenience. I sat at the kitchen table. I picked up the pen. And I asked her one question before I signed. Has your attorney reviewed the Section 14 distribution clause in the trust lately? She went very still. Specifically, I said, The clause that requires the qualifying heir to be the biological child of the primary male heir and a legal spouse at the time of birth. I set down the pen. Our daughter was born while we are legally married. That's on record. My name is on her birth certificate. Her father's name is on her birth certificate. Whatever I sign today, that record doesn't change. She stared at me. I also spoke with a trust litigation specialist this morning, I continued. If you attempt to contest my daughter's status as a qualifying heir, the trust records become part of the litigation discovery. All of them, including the distributions that were made to the LLC that I'm fairly certain your tax attorneys don't know about. There it was, the thing Derek had found on the second day, buried in a 2019 amendment, a series of distributions to a shell company that had no apparent business purpose and no corresponding tax filings that I could locate. Whether it was tax avoidance or something else, I didn't know yet, but I knew it was enough. My mother-in-law stood up from the table. She left the agreement behind. She did not offer me another goodwill gesture. Here is what happened in the weeks after that. I retained a divorce attorney, a woman with 20 years of family law experience who had, in her own words, seen every version of the story and wasn't impressed by any of them. I filed for divorce on the grounds of marital infidelity. I had documentation. The receipts, the hotel records, the phone records that my husband hadn't thought to scrub carefully enough. It turned out he'd been seeing someone for the better part of a year. Someone his mother knew about. Someone his mother had, according to the text messages I eventually obtained through discovery, actively encouraged him to keep seeing. The divorce took 8 months. During those 8 months, I moved back to Greenville with my daughter, and my mom helped me with childcare while I worked. It was tight. It was hard. There were nights I sat in my childhood bedroom with my daughter asleep on my chest and thought about all the ways this was not how I'd imagined my life at 31. But I also kept working the trust angle. The shell company distributions were real and they were not small. My litigation specialist and I handed our findings over to a CPA who specialized in forensic accounting. What she found took another 3 months to fully document. But the short version is this. Over a period of 7 years, approximately $4 million had been moved through that LLC in a way that was not consistent with legitimate business operations. Whether my mother-in-law knew the full extent of it, or whether it had been managed by someone else in the family's financial team, I couldn't say definitively. But the paper trail existed. I didn't go to the IRS. I went to the other beneficiaries of the trust. My husband had a sister, quiet, kept to herself, lived out of state. I'd met her 3 times at family events. She'd always been polite to me in the way that people are when they're trying to stay neutral in a conflict they didn't start. I sent her attorney a letter outlining what I'd found. Not a threat, an informational letter. I included the documentation. Her attorney called mine 2 days later. It turned out the sister had her own grievances about how the trust had been managed. She'd been raising questions for years and getting nowhere. My documentation gave her something concrete to bring to the trust's independent trustee. The independent trustee launched an internal review. By the time my divorce was finalized, my mother-in-law had stepped down as the trust's managing director, pending the outcome of that review. My husband's anticipated inheritance was frozen. The shell company was being unwound. And my daughter? My daughter's status as a qualifying heir under the trust was confirmed in writing by the trustee's office, which meant that regardless of whatever her father did or didn't eventually receive, her own rights under the document were protected until she turned 18. At which point she could make her own decisions. The divorce settlement was fair, not generous, fair. I didn't want anything that wasn't mine. I wanted what was mine, and I got it. I want to tell you that there was a single moment, a movie moment, where everything clicked into place and I felt triumphant. There wasn't. It was mostly paperwork, long phone calls, Derek pulling documents at odd hours, my mom watching my daughter so I could take depositions. It was ordinary work done persistently over a long time, and the result of that work was that people who had assumed I didn't understand how things worked found out that I did. My daughter is 10 months old now. She pulls herself up on the coffee table and looks genuinely offended when she falls down, like gravity is a personal affront. She has 4 teeth and opinions about everything. She doesn't sleep enough, and neither do I, and I wouldn't trade any of it. My mother-in-law sent a letter through her attorney 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized. I won't say what it said. I'll say that I read it once, put it in a file, and went to make breakfast. Some offers, it turns out, aren't worth the paper they're printed on, and some paper trails are worth everything. If you've ever sat across from someone who looked at you and saw a transaction, who took stock of where you came from and decided that told them everything about where you were going, I want you to know something. They miscounted. They always miscalculate, because people who see other people as problems to be managed have a particular blind spot. They cannot imagine that the person sitting across from them has already done the math. I had done the math. I took my daughter home. I did my job. I followed the paper trail, and when it was over, I was still standing at the kitchen table. They were not. I've thought a lot about what actually happened in that hospital room. Not the legal part. I've replayed that enough. I mean, what was really happening underneath it, in the space between what my mother-in-law believed and what was actually true. She walked in, with an attorney and a number, and the absolute certainty that I would take the deal. And I understand why she thought that. She'd spent 3 years watching me navigate a world I hadn't grown up in, and she'd interpreted every careful step I took as evidence that I was out of my depth. She saw someone trying hard to keep up. What she didn't see was someone paying attention. That's the thing about underestimating people. It doesn't just leave you wrong, it leaves you exposed. I'm not going to pretend I handled all of it gracefully. There were nights in my mom's house in Greenville where I sat with my daughter on my chest and cried in a way I hadn't cried since I was a teenager. That ugly, exhausted kind of crying that doesn't feel like release. It just feels like the bottom. I was 31 years old, recently divorced, living in my childhood bedroom, rebuilding from a marriage I had genuinely believed in. That is not a triumphant feeling. It just isn't. But here's what I kept coming back to. On those nights, I had done the right thing at every step. Not because I knew it would work out, but because it was the right thing. I didn't manufacture the evidence. I didn't threaten anyone. I did my job, the same job I'd been doing for years, following paper trails and asking the questions that made people uncomfortable. And I let the facts do what facts do when they're given space to exist. My mother-in-law made her choices over years. The shell company didn't appear overnight. The manipulation of the trust, the calculated positioning, the decision to walk into a hospital room 14 hours after her grandchild was born and put a dollar amount on that child's mother, none of that happened in a moment. It accumulated, and what I've come to understand is that the consequences accumulated the same way. Slowly, then all at once. I think about Derek, who pulled those documents without asking why, because he trusted my judgment. I think about June, who sat in a hospital waiting room for 2 hours with a woman she barely knew because that's what neighbors do when it matters. I think about Stella, who had her own quiet grievances for years and just needed someone to hand her something solid to stand on. None of them were trying to be heroes. They were just doing what decent people do. That's what I want to remember about all of this, more than the legal outcome. The people who showed up, not because they owed me anything, but because showing up was the right thing to do. And the reality that none of what I built after that marriage ended would have been possible if I hadn't spent years doing work that was real, building skills that were mine, being someone with enough professional credibility that when I needed to follow a paper trail at the worst moment of my life, I actually knew how. You don't build that overnight either. You build it the same way. Consequences accumulate, slowly, consistently, without knowing exactly when it's going to matter. My daughter pulled herself up on the coffee table this morning and looked at me like she'd invented standing. Maybe she thinks she did. I'm not going to correct her yet. Some things are worth building without knowing what they're for.